Hi, I'm Tom Woods, and you're listening to the Libertarian Christian Podcast.
Welcome to the show that gets Christians thinking about faith and politics. Get ready to challenge the status quo, expand your imagination, and tackle controversy head on. Let's stand together at the intersection of faith and freedom. It's time for the Libertarian Christian Podcast.
Welcome to another episode of the Libertarian Christian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute. I'm your host, Doug Stewart, and I have Norman Horn with me today, and we have a special guest who's actually really special to me because he tutored me in basic introductory Greek. He helped me think more clearly about a Jesus-centered hermeneutic, and he was also the first guy who taught me about mimetic theory, Michael Hardin. He is an independent scholar residing in Pennsylvania. He has a master's from North Park Seminary in Chicago and is a PhD candidate at Charles Sturt University in Australia, where his thesis is on religion and revelation in Karl Barth and Rene Girard. He is the author of the excellent book, The Jesus-Driven Life and Reading the Bible with Rene Girard, and among other books, and a score of peer-reviewed articles. He's a popular teacher with a broad global audience, and he is known as the Dude of Theology. That's a moniker he carries proudly. Thanks for joining us today, Michael.
Thanks, Doug. Thank you, Norm.
Oh, well, it's definitely a pleasure to have you here. And I've got to start off with, okay, Dude of Theology. Now, that sounds pretty cool, and I have a guess at what that means, but I'd kind of like to hear the story about how you picked up this nickname.
Well, first of all, I've got rather long hair and the same kind of goatee that Jeff Bridges wore in The Big Lebowski.
Okay.
And I drink vodka, and I lounge a lot, and I tend to smoke a wee bit from time to time, So anyway, when I was in Australia lecturing at a university, one of the faculty members said, "Man, you are the Dude of Theology." And I thought it was pretty cool. I even put it on Facebook. This is back in 2012, and then the following year, Brian Zond and Brad Jerzak asked me if I'd fly to California and introduce them to Girard. So I flew out, and took him to see Renee and Martha and spend the day. But when I met Brian Zond for the first time, we sat down, we're visiting. He says, "Man, you are the Dude of Theology." And I said to myself, you know what? That works for me.
I'll let that stick. Thank you very much. But do you drink White Russians too? That's more important than the vodka. Okay,
yes,
good.
Grey Goose. Grey Goose.
All right. Well, next time when we get together, we'll compare notes on how to make the best White Russian then. So
I'd love to do that.
Excellent. Well, you mentioned immediately, Rene Girard, and you and I both know that we talk about mimetic theory here, and we all know about Girard. But, whenever we talk about Rene Girard and mimetic theory, it's usually a good idea for, those who may be less familiar with the idea to get kind of a quick overview about what that means. And it's also a good exercise for all of us trying to explain mimetic theory. So could you maybe give us like an elevator pitch version of what is mimetic theory in short?
Well, mimetic theory, first of all, is not technically a theory. And Bob Emerson Kelly made it clear. It's actually phenomenologically observable. It's realism. So the term I prefer these days is mimetic realism.
Okay.
Partly because there's now a tremendous amount of science in scores of disciplines that validate the basic insights of the mimetic theory. The first basic insight is that we humans don't know what we want. Once our basic needs are met, we're the only creature that has wants, and we go seeking to fulfill this inner need. Well, how do we do that? We copy the wants of someone around us. We imitate their desire. Now, if we are primates and we engage in that behavior, which primates do, we have a breaking mechanism when we encounter each other in a rivalry. I want what you want what I want. We both want the same thing, so we fight over the banana or the female in the troop. And once one of us submits, bam, it's done. The dominant ape wins. Humans lack that breaking mechanism, and so the rivalry will consistently accelerate to the point of death. So for humans, because they lack any ability to step on a brake pedal, inside of themselves biologically, we've lost that with the growth of the human brain, the bicameral spheres, the corpus callosum that interconnects everything, and the massive number of neural networks that run through our cranium. We've lost that. And so we had to find a way to deal with our violence, particularly as hominids are emerging in the evolutionary process from the apes. And these groups, if they ended up in rivalrous confrontations, exterminated themselves. But eventually, over a period of time, groups would realize that and this is all non-conscious, of course, but when the aggression of the group is taken out on an individual within the group, a weaker individual, usually the weakest, the aggression's gone. There's something that remains, and that's peace. As this begins to develop over tens or hundreds of thousands of years, at some point, consciousness arises, and the victim for the first time will be chosen. That is, there's a finger pointed, and then that gesture is imitated, and then you have a victim, and now you have a scapegoat religion, and now you have gods, and eventually culture. And this has all been validated from the neural networks piece of it, through studies in rivalry and escalation of rivalries, to religion as the postulate of civilization rather than the other way around, with the evidence at Göbekli Tepe. So there's just a lot of science in this. And that's why I prefer mimetic realism.
Okay, that's really interesting. And I kind of appreciate the kind of corrective effort of going about calling it realism, because there is certainly so many observable things in our current society right now where we live, where this is so evident when you begin to understand kind of the principles of the theory. So when you're talking about, this pointing the finger and choosing the victim, like, this is a very weird thing to us, I think, even in today's day and age. It feels kind of strange because, like, intuitively you begin to hear about it, and the moment you begin to kind of understand what's going on, it kind of gives you that tingly feeling like, oh my goodness, I'm learning something, I'm observing something I didn't quite know before. This is really interesting. But I think there's also a sense in which, we are affected in our Western world in the year, 2020, that does make it feel a little different than it did, say, in antiquity, the time of the Israelites, for instance. So what exactly changed, or why does it feel different now than it did, say, in days of yore like that?
Well, my work is primarily in Second Temple Judaism and early Christianity. So you'll notice I just said the key word temple. Antiquity had temples. They still had sacrificial practices. We don't have those anymore. We have no unified, consistent sacrificial mechanism that works anymore. And because it's the gospel that has broken down the sacrificial mechanism over the last 2,000 years, we are now left without the protection of sacrifice. What that means is, when we try scapegoating, it won't work. The last great scapegoat of Western culture is Adolf Hitler.
Interesting.
Now, you notice I said scapegoat, and people go, but he wasn't innocent. No, you're absolutely correct. Scapegoats don't have to be innocent. Innocence or guilt is not the important part of being the scapegoat. Being the scapegoat is just simply the figure around whom everyone can say, you know what, you're our problem. Without you, you're gone. And so I could reference, for example, the breakdown of the mechanism after 1991-92, when we went into Desert Storm, and we let Saddam Hussein, we said, okay, so you can take Kuwait, and he does, and then we have this little skirmish. But it's not until after 9/11, when there's a desperate need for a scapegoat, someone we can all blame this on, and we get Saddam Hussein, and he's tried and executed, and that doesn't unite the world. And then we get Osama bin Laden. He's not tried, but he's executed, whatever you want to call it, taken out or terminated, and that doesn't unite the world. Now it's Trump's turn. Various Canadian prime ministers go through this from time to time, as well as, European leaders. And, you have your occasional big, strong man in Africa, or someone like Kim Jong-un in North Korea. But the world can't agree on who the problem is anymore, because the world does not understand that it itself is the problem.
Interesting. So would you say then that if we look at, especially at recent history through a mimetic lens like this, we can observe that there are some kind of scapegoat figures that are happening both in kind of large and small scale. What do you think about that? Is there, you've mentioned Saddam Hussein, Osama bin Laden, we've got Trump, we've got some of other world leaders. You could also say that, Kim Jong-un, there's even a sense in which there's some small, and of course, Vladimir Putin. And again, these aren't necessarily innocent people, but there definitely is a sense that the culture around us is trying to pin blame on something
Always.
For all the problems that we're receiving.
Always.
So
China's next.
Oh yeah, I think so. And I've
China's
definitely
going to
been
be the big scapegoat coming up to the November elections.
It'll be very interesting to see how
Or
that proceeds.
I should say an attempt. Trump and the Republicans will attempt to scapegoat China, and the Democrats may well buy into that narrative.
Yeah, and if they do, I mean, because to be fair, the folks on the left are definitely looking at Trump as a scapegoat in so many ways. Do you think there's a sense in which that, the right in their response to that have been trying, with some measure of success to deflect that blame onto other sources, such as China?
Well, yeah, nobody yet in the Democrat or Republican sphere is technically a scapegoat.
Okay.
Obama was perceived as a rival by the Republicans, okay? The Mitch McConnell Republicans.
Sure.
And then Trump is perceived as a rival by the Pelosi-Schumer Democrats. Trump perceives Biden as a rival, which he is. Biden perceives Trump. I mean, this is all rivalry still. Nobody's a scapegoat.
Okay.
So this is where we're just right now in all the rivalries.
Oh, okay.
And it's only as the rivalries escalate completely out of control and both parties to the rivalry are imitating each other so much you can't distinguish them. And this is why it's so important for Mr. Biden not to stoop to Trump's rhetorical level.
I see. Interesting.
In other words, he needs to treat Trump not as a rival. He needs to treat himself. Biden needs to present himself as a far superior alternative to Trump. Trump's not even in the rivalry. That's the way he'll win this thing.
This sort of reminds me of this is very much in line with the way libertarians observe, what's going on between the left and the right. And we think it's probably simplistic to think of it as left and right and center and so forth. I mean, it's a lot more dynamic and three-dimensional or four-dimensional than that. But is this more than just rivalry and where do we blame and where is the blame going and stuff? Like, it seems like the introductory thought process for me when I think of mimetic theory or mimetic realism is that there's a lot of blame going back and forth and it sort of escalates to a point. Is that one way to think about it, or is that just, sort of oversimplifying it? Or is there more going on there?
No, that's an important way to think about it, but I want you to put that in the context of a children's game, like hot potato or musical chairs. The point of those children's games is to teach children to pass the thing along or to make sure when the music stops, they're not the one that's left out. Mm-hmm. Okay? What we see happening in our culture today are these children's games being played out on political levels. So hot potato, I can blame you, Doug, and you can blame me, and I'll blame you twice as much, and you'll blame me twice as much, and we'll just keep trading back and forth until we're no longer distinguishable. For example, and people can relate to this. Couples, when they're first married, or even longer, an argument begins. Maybe it's something very simple. The wife asks the husband to do the dishes. The husband asks the wife to do something. Whatever happens, the argument starts simple. The next thing you know, it's escalated 3, 4, 5 years in the past. It's bringing up a zillion resentments, and it ends up going way somewhere that it never started. You understand what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
Okay. This is what we're seeing today, is this escalating rivalry where the two parties are becoming mirror doubles or mirror twins of one another. And that's why Girard observes in his book, Violence in the Sacred, and other books, twins were often killed in the ancient world because somehow the humans knew that these mimetic doubles were trouble, like Pollux and Castor.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Romulus and Remus.
Romulus and Remus, Cain and Abel. Yeah. Yep. I just happen to be a Gemini, so maybe that's why I'm always beating myself. I don't know.
Okay.
There you go.
I think I just heard the most academic explanation for why politics is childishness.
By comparing it to children's games. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
Well, Michael, most recently, we've really seen, what could be amount to just a wild series of events in our world. Of course, we're talking about things like coronavirus and even the protests that resulted from that. The folks who were protesting because they didn't want the lockdowns, and that's, that has some logic to it, I know. But then, there's the murder of George Floyd, and prior to that, Breonna Taylor, and not to mention, of course, there's plenty of other totally unjust police killings. And the ensuing protests and riots of the past couple of weeks have just been, really rocked the nation. So to me, when I look at this and I think, wow, there is so much that can be unpacked here regarding from a mimetic realist perspective. I barely know where to start. So from your point of view, how can or should, mimetics inform our interpretation of these events? How would you go about even doing that?
Well, the first thing I think is you have to really pay close attention to what's happening by using many, many types of information channels. So as I look at the current situation on the street, what I see are wonderful, incredible, peaceful protests. And I also see outside agitators. I have seen agitators from both the left and the right, pictures and videos. Yep. I wonder, I wouldn't put it past the government to send in infiltrators like they did in the 60s and 70s, that's how governments work, So when I look at this, I have to recognize, first of all, on just kind of a phenomenological level, my heart is with those that seek peace and justice. That's where my heart is.
Absolutely.
But I'm also aware that any attempts that the citizens of a country make to change their government in a peaceful way are often met with violence, although interestingly enough, at the end of his book, Engaging the Powers, Walter Wink has page after page after page of successful nonviolent revolution that occurred in the 20th century. So it's quite possible we have been practicing enough that we'll actually be able to pull the next one off without a war. I don't know. But at any rate, that's the first piece. The second piece is that for me, America's roots are religious roots. They're Calvinistic roots. And you have two types of religious roots in New England. You have the Puritans and you have the Congregationalists. Both of them are Gnostic. America is a Gnostic, dualistic country in its presuppositions, in its base nature, in its being.
So you may have to unpack that a little more, because I'm sure a lot of people will kind of cock an eye to that and go, ooh, what do you mean?
Well, what I mean is this. You can take a book like Against the Protestant Gnostics by Philip Lee. It's a 1987 Oxford University Press book, and the thesis has never been refuted. And in that book, Lee goes back and examines conservative preaching and theology, as well as the so-called liberal preaching and theology in the 17th and 18th centuries in the United States of America, and doesn't really move beyond that because he's dealing with origins. And then he notices that both, as he looks at the presuppositions of both the right and the left, they're identical and they're Gnostic. And the argument in America is who has the right to the presuppositions.
Yeah.
And that's why we have the religious wars that we have. So with that as kind of a building block, then I went in and did a lot of research back in the 80s when I was in seminary. I had my church history prof, Philip Anderson, his dissertation was on the Puritans. And so we had a great education in the Puritans. And I'm not, I'm at a Lutheran pietistic school with a church historian that has, is not uncritical of the Puritans, but also can show great respect for them. And then we're doing the same thing with the early Congregationalists. And at the same time, of course, I'm engaging Barth, Bonhoeffer, Bultmann, and all these others. But as I'm doing this, what I'm beginning to see is that American society has never been united, ever. The only time we were truly united was when we, all 13 colonies, agreed that King George was the problem. But once we got rid of King George, you go look at the late 1780s and 90s, and then it's just war after war after war after war. America has been a nation with an external enemy forever. And when we don't have an external enemy. The Cold War is over. What happens? Well, then you got Newt Gingrich to Contract for America. The Democrats are evil.
Seems like a pretty solid thesis there. I mean, it's definitely been the case that we've seen that kind of going at each other's throats in a way that just seems, I mean, it just looks different once you get into that era.
Think about the dualisms right now. Black men, white police officer, right?
Mm-hmm.
The economy or lives saved through lockdown. I could probably name more. Those are the first two that came to my mind, but Americans only know how to think in a binary pattern. And that's why the only Americans that really make a difference are the entrepreneurs.
Yeah, It is really interesting.
They're the ones that think outside the box.
Well, it certainly follows along with the libertarian idea that the biggest way that we get social change is not the motions of the state and what it's doing, but rather through the progress of people like the entrepreneurs. And really, we could even, on some level, we could generalize that and say the religious entrepreneurs even. And not in the sense of, let's get mega churches and televangelists and whatnot, but rather people who are making progress in the development of the way that we think about Scripture, the way that we think about our relationship with God, and the way that we think about being a church together. And so I'm using that in a very general sense, that it's not really about money, but about that sort of progress of thought.
Yes. I think we're going to look back. I mean, I'm 63, and however much longer I have to live, I'm going to look back at my life, basically the years that I was living, the 70s, 80s, 90s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, in this last 20 years, particularly from the 90s forward. Those were the supersize years, man. Those were the years I mean, they were amazing. And I don't think we're going to see that for a long, long time, if ever again, because first of all, COVID has shown that we don't need big office spaces. WeWork doesn't need to exist. People can work from home. We can keep labor costs down. We've seen all kinds of things, but AI and robotization are going to absolutely change the workplace. And we're looking at I think in the next decade, we're looking at 1.6 billion people unemployed. I think it's going to get really, really ugly out there.
Well, to an extent, I think that there's definitely going to be a shift as AI allows for different types of jobs to essentially become deprecated to code. But that's sort of the process of certain types of progress in the first place, right?
Oh, dude, we have to go through this. I mean, we are so what's the word I want to use here? Cluttered as a species. Yeah. We're cluttered mentally. We're cluttered psychologically. We're cluttered. We're just cluttered. And we do need massive cleansing in a way.
Yeah, there's a massive inefficiencies that are the result of, just massive buildups of really just, you could say, economically inefficient activities.
Well, I'll tell you, one of them is making bombs.
Yes, darn right.
If they took all the money they spent on making bombs and they just helped the communities that had the deep needs, the world would be a totally different place.
Oh, yeah. Even we've discussed on our show, like, as much as we do not like the welfare state, but, if we could just agree to end wars and the military industrial complex, dude, I'll be fine with, certain parts of welfare for the time being. Like, let's just get rid of the killing first.
For those who are poor, not corporations, not that kind of welfare.
And this, think about this, man. The entire United States of America just went socialist.
Yeah.
With the Fed bailing out the corporations, man. I mean, this is Republican socialism. I mean, how can Republicans decry socialism when they're just a socialist and they've just created? Well, I won't say it. My mind went places. I'll leave that.
But they've been doing this for 30 years, though, too. I mean, this happened.
They've been doing it since 1913.
Oh, well, that's absolutely true as well. But I mean, even just in terms of the bailouts, we've been seeing that since the 90s, no doubt. Yeah. And it's just that now it's getting recouched in, we need to do this. Like George Bush II said, we have to abandon free market principles to save the free market.
Free market system.
And a free market system or something to that effect. And it's just, you want to facepalm yourself and go like, well, that just is nonsensical in the first place, man.
Yeah. Well, I kind of think lately you have to be basic. Well, no, Obama and Clinton were very bright, but Bush and Trump, I'm.
I have a question about the way in which we think about the wealthy. You mentioned the entrepreneur
Yes.
a moment ago, and right now it seems like the wealthy are these, I want to say the scapegoats, maybe that's overstating it, but they're the ones who are being, like, of all the people who are like conspiracy theorists, it's like Bill Gates is the guy that we need to fear, or Jeff Bezos is the guy that shouldn't have as much money as he does.
Right.
I mean, what does a way of looking at the world where wealthy people have things that masses of people say, well, that shouldn't exist? I mean, somebody like me looks at that and says, well, that's just envy, right? And it's not envy in the sense that I want what you have, but it's envy in the sense of you shouldn't have what I don't want you to have.
Well, that's all true, Doug. That's all. I mean, that's yes. If I'm going to talk about this, it's not just mimetic theory, though, that's going to inform my perspective. It's also going to be the gospel. So I can't do just kind of a straight mimetic. How does a mimetic theorist look at wealth? I mean, because I know mimetic theorists that are broke, and I know mimetic theorists that are billionaires.
Well, fair point. Well, part of my question was not articulated, but inform us with the gospel on that if you have any thoughts.
Well, I have to tell you, it's been an interesting thing for me. So I have to personalize this because you've known me, Doug, now for 8 years now, I think, at least.
Yeah, something
perhaps. Like that. And you knew me, as a theologian, just an independent scholar here living 8 miles from you. I'm traveling the world, I'm writing books, we'd visit and stuff. And I'm barely making ends meet, but I'm paying the bills, right? And then this last year, I realized at 63 I was broke. And so I ended up, figuring out gold was the way to go. And I've gotten to the gold business. And here's what I've discovered. I have money now. I've got more than I need ever. And I have a different orientation to it. And so I want to tell you a story. Back in December of 2017, I was learning how to trade on the Forex. And I'm very broke back then. And I had $100 just in my account to trade. And I got in there on a trade on, these little 10-cent pips, right? And I think it's going to go one way, it goes another. And I'm watching this thing lose a dime at a time. And by the time it hit minus $2, I had broken out in a cold sweat. And I got out of the trade and I said, Michael Hardin, what is wrong with you? That's $2. What's going on with you and money? What kind of attachment do you have to it? And I had to do a lot of analysis at that point, asking myself, what was going on inside of me between me and money. And Doug, I was envious. I needed it. I had to collect it. I had to have it, but I couldn't get it. And so I resented others that had it. It was a bother to me, and it was a challenge for me to say, this is my issue. This is not the issue of, when we first met you, you have the lovely home up there with that beautiful backyard and front view, and Lori and I are living in an apartment, remember that?
Yeah.
And so when I came to your house, I'd look and I'd say, I wish I could have something like this. I'll never be able to afford it, but I became really aware that that's how I existed. And now that the bills are paid and things are good, I find myself being very generous. And I found myself being too generous. I was giving too much away, if you know what I mean, if that's possible. I'm not St. Francis yet. Maybe someday Jesus will call me to do that, but I do have to take care of the family. And so I'm finding myself in these wild swings back and forth in relation to money. And all of that to say that what I'm discovering is I don't want any relationship with money. I don't want money. I don't want to have a relationship with it. It's not. I have relationships with a lot of things. I have a relationship with Karl Barth and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, even though they're dead. I have a relationship with them. I have a relationship with my guitar. I have a relationship with my drum set. I have a relationship with my hot tub, in addition to people. But in my backyard, I have a good relationship with, but I don't want a relationship with money. What I've discovered money needs to be in my life is just a simple thing that it was meant to be, a medium of exchange, and that's it. Having it, not having it, I've had both. I like having it. The financial security is incredible. But I know if I lost it now, I'm still loved by the Father and it's all good. And circumstances are not a barometer of the Father's love. And so these are the things I've kind of discovered all together these last couple of years. And so I'm sitting here, and I'm looking for a dollar bill. I don't even have cash anymore. But if I had a dollar bill, I used to know exactly how I felt about that, how I held on to it, how I clung to it, and how I envied those that had things. I remember people would tell me, some of the older folks, even when I was with Preaching Peace, the board members would say, oh, we're going to go to India and we're going to go visit this place and we're going to the Caribbean. And I'd never been in any of those places. Couldn't afford to go. The most money I ever made was like $35,000 in a year, And I was jealous. I really was, because here I am giving my life away to Jesus for the church, and I got no fees, and I'm making no money. I got no 401k. I got nothing, and I was jealous. And then all of a sudden I'm making money, and I'm realizing, you know what? There's going to be people jealous of me. It's the human condition. But I'm certainly not jealous of Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates, because I'm not looking for wealth. I just want to make sure that my wife and I can get through this next decade without too much worry. That's all I'm looking for.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think your message in that respect to us, or what can we walk away from that discussion, which is just fascinating, is to really, kind of examine ourselves. I mean, that's the call of Scripture in any given point, is that, to go away and examine oneself and think about what is your relationship with possessions, with money, and these sorts of things, and to come to grips with what that means. So I'm grateful for that, because it's a good reminder to be mindful of these things. So thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome.
And so to kind of, as we begin to sort of drive toward our close here, I want to go back a little bit more to the mimetic theory side. And because I know that sometimes when we talk about these sorts of things, it's very heady. Maybe it seems really societal level and not always something directly personal. Sometimes it just depends on where we're at any given point, I suppose. But we've been talking about societal level stuff. So what I want to do here is let's draw that back in kind of to this personal side as we've been going on right now. On the personal side of mimetic realism, what can we use there that helps us to love our neighbor better and perhaps draw closer to God as a result?
Okay, that's a wonderful question. One of the stories that Rene Girard loved to tell, it's a worthy story. He says one day he's lecturing, and afterwards this woman comes to him and she says, "Oh, Professor Girard, that was so wonderful. This whole thing, the phenomenon of scapegoating and the way you did it." She says, "Because in my family system, I've been the scapegoat." And she goes on and on and on about how her family blames her for everything. And what Rene walked away from is he said, it's easy for us to recognize other people's scapegoating behavior, but we cannot recognize it in ourselves. It's non-conscious. So the first question that gets asked of the Apostle Paul that creates his conversion is, why are you using violence against me? Why are you engaging in violence against me? That's the question. It's the same exact thing. Paul had to recognize he's a persecutor before he could learn to follow in the footsteps of what it means to be the forgiving victim, not the victim like Abel, whose blood cries out for vengeance, but the victim like Jesus, the forgiving victim. And there's more in that in my books if people want. But once you begin by recognizing your own scapegoating, if you're a Christian, you should know that every time you go to Mass or communion or whatever you call it in your tradition, when the priest stands up and he holds up the bread, and he breaks it and then he passes it around, he holds up the cup and he passes it around. When we do this little kind of little interior, little me and Jesus thing going on, right? Really what's happening up there is a murder. So I'll tell you a quick story. I'm in England 5-6 years ago, and I'm invited to do a communion after a meal at a house church, and there's this long wooden table with these long benches, and there's probably 15, 17 people around this table. So, we'd had the meal and they'd talk devotionally like house church people do, and they handed me the bread and the cup, and they said, "Would you do communion for us?" I said, "Sure." And I picked up the bread knife, Now, if your editor needs to edit stuff out here, I understand. But I picked up that bread knife and I started stabbing that bread. And I'm going, Jesus, you hate you stupid son of God. I'm stabbing this bread for all I'm worth. And then I turned and I passed the bread and I passed the knife to the next person. They couldn't do anything. They passed it. It went like 4 or 5 people before somebody was able to kind of tepidly pick up the knife and kind of poke the bread a little bit. I don't like you, Jesus. I don't like you. I don't like you. You know, and the bread went around the table. Vast majority of people could not do it. And then I passed the cup and I said, for those of you that have just killed the living Lord, here, he says, I forgive you. And the people that had at least tried to stab the bread had an incredible emotional experience compared to the others. Why? Because they recognized they were persecutors and that they were forgiven persecutors. Now, that's the Eucharist, and that should be the function of the Eucharist in the church, but instead, we've hidden the victim, tidied it all up, turned it into some kind of little ritual we sit and engage in and play with, rather than recognizing it's the most primal ritual of all, human cannibalism. And we are called to come and eat the bread of life.
Yeah, the significance of this has not been fully, I think, realized in, well, certainly not throughout my personal history, but kind of realizing that the do this in remembrance of me, in as much as the theories of the Eucharist are kind of proffered in various, theological traditions and whatnot, in many respects, so many Protestants have really wanted to go so far against what they complain about sometimes in the Catholic tradition that we really miss out on this very real sense that we are in a sense reenacting that murder.
We precisely are reenacting that murder.
And by doing so, we're exposing ourselves to the reality of not just who we are, but what God has in store for us. And it is to experience that forgiveness in a way that it, like you said, is very primal. And that I wish
absolutely,
and I wish that people could hear that in the right way as many times as possible, to where it's not just, communion is more than just a little pass around with some flowery language, but it's recognizing death, it's recognizing burial and resurrection as well, and that's so good.
It removes the Platonism of community. Most of us have Platonic views of community, just like we have Platonic views of marriage. And we assume that all these things can be hunky-dory, and that is not the world. I mean, Jesus said, the poor you will have with you always. You know what he means by that? He talks about the poor in his teaching, but it's connected with two other things, debt and forgiveness. And as long as there's debt in the world, there's going to be the poor. And as long as there's moral debt in the world, as long as it's the Christians that are kind of acting like some grand inquisitor, then there's only going to be an impoverished world.
Yeah.
The Christians have given up their post. On October 28th of 2017, I was in Dallastown near where Doug and I live, and I preached the sermon for that Reformation Sunday. And I opened by telling people today's an incredible day. It's 500-year celebration of the Reformation. And I talked about churches around the world and what some of them would be doing. And I said, but I'm here today to give you the funeral sermon for Protestantism. And that's what I proceeded to do.
And it's interesting, hearkening back to the earlier part of the conversation, I'm becoming more convinced that the way that we're often approaching communion is, in a sense, a Gnostic practice.
Precisely.
What do we mean by that? Okay. When we enter into communion just with this ethereal idea of, well, we just do this in remembrance of me, and that's it. Maybe read a scripture or two alongside it or something, but not recognizing the body. And that's another scriptural phrase, if you'll remember, recognizing the body.
Of course.
If you don't do that, recognize the body, then you're, in a sense, denying the physicality of it. And the denial of the physical is crucial to the Gnostic proposition.
Absolutely.
And so I think we could go on for that for a long time, I'm pretty sure.
We have like a whole nother episode just on this just topic, yeah.
Well, Gnostic Christianity, I mean, I've been, oh man, I could give you some stories about what the things that I have seen and related to this sort of stuff and beyond, but it's not the time and place for it. But maybe next time we're up to.
This has been my battle, has been against Gnostic Christianity since my first published article in 1985.
Wow. All right. See,
I've been battling this for my whole life.
Yeah. And we're appreciative of it for sure. So I know that you've been also in recent efforts publishing. And so what is this recent book you got coming out about consumer Christianity that I keep hearing? What's this
the
all
title?
about?
The title is Knowing God with a question mark. Originally, it was just Knowing God. It was my way of essentially saying to the J.I. Packer evangelical tradition, thank you very much, but your God isn't worth knowing. So instead, I just put Knowing God with a question mark, and the subtitle is Consumer Christianity and the Gospel of Jesus. And in that book, in the first 3 chapters, 2 or 3 chapters, whatever it is, I used my friend John Paul's metaphor of the church experience as a shopping mall, or the shopping mall, rather, is a religious experience. He has a great book on this called Shopping Malls and Sacred Spaces. And I basically talk about Protestantism as a great big mall you can go into. You got all your different stores hawking all their different wares, doctrines, and dogmas. I talk about the evangelical stores and make fun of them. I talk about the liberal, progressive, politically correct store, which deals in fair trade products, these kinds of, and then the charismatic store with, all the lights and the sound and the film. I basically am just critiquing that. And then I critique especially the phenomenon of Christian mysticism, which basically, for my money today, 95% of Christians out there that are on a so-called spiritual or mystical path because they're trying to make connections somehow with the divine because the church has so failed them, and God bless their heart, and may Jesus come and find them in their darkness. But most of them have just become syncretists. And there's no real gospel core to their spirituality, and that's why there's such a lack of ethics. But then the second half of the book reconstructs the gospel, and there is a theological move I make in that book that I don't know that has been made before in the history of Christianity. I start with where's the gospel start? I start with Paul, crucifixion. In the West, in the East, the church begins with incarnation. But I start with crucifixion, I move through resurrection, ascension, and then I come back to incarnation with the return of Jesus, the doctrine of the Holy Spirit, the church connected to discipleship, incarnational life, that we are the living person of Jesus today as he was then, and bring all of that together. And I don't know that that's been done before.
Well, that's really exciting. I'll have to get a copy of that as soon as I can and take a look. I'm excited to read it.
It's a cure for insomnia.
Probably underselling it. You should probably say something a little better about it. But yeah. No, I've read at least 3, maybe 4 of your books, and they've all had me both scratching my head at times and then later thinking, okay, yeah, got it. And so they are good books for a journey for those who are wanting to know God more in ways that, I want to say the word fresh, and I know that can sound more dangerous than it is, but fresh ways in the sense that you want to get closer and closer to
How about
the Lord.
Authentic?
Yeah. No, that's good. So I really appreciate your work, and I hope listeners will reach out to buy your books. And do you have a website, or is this like follow you on Facebook?
My website is preachingpeace.org, but Amazon has my book, all my books.
Okay, good. Well, I appreciate you coming on to talk with us, and you've been one of the people I've been like, I got to have Michael on. And I promise it won't be 175 episodes from now. You'll be on way before then. So
That's fine.
There's a lot more for us to dive into from what we've talked about today. So I appreciate you joining us.
It has sure been fun to speak with both of you, and Doug, it's been great. And I look forward to this thing being over. It'd be great just to take a social distance walk with you, man.
Yeah, well, I have a fire pit, so we can easily sit 6 feet apart or more.
That sounds like a good idea. I've been to that fire pit.
That's right. Yeah, we had just got that. So it's been a long time, brother. So yeah. All right. Well, to more social time and another episode in the future.
There you go.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Libertarian Christian Podcast. If you liked today's episode, we encourage you to rate us on Apple Podcasts to help expand our audience. If you want to reach out to us, email us at podcast@libertarianchristians.com. You can also reach us at LCI Official on Twitter. And of course, we are on Facebook and have an active group you are welcome to join. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Libertarian Christian Podcast is a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute, a registered 501c3 nonprofit. If you'd like to find out more about LCI, visit us on the web at libertarianchristians.com. The voiceovers are by Matt Bellis and Catherine Williams. As of episode 115, our audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.
Hey, podcast listeners. Since you like listening to audio content, we wanted to let you know about a new audiobook titled Called to Freedom: Why You Can Be Christian and Libertarian. It's read by me, Jacqueline Isaacs, one of the contributing authors of the book, and every download helps to support the Libertarian Christian Institute. To learn more and to download the audiobook today, go to calltofreedombook.com.